Okay, okay. Well, we'll go ahead and get started. Alrighty, so today we are gonna finish talking about projectives, and then we should have some time for you all to start the next set of assessments you're going to do. So, exercise. Okay, does anyone want a printed copy of the exam? Okay. You want one? Perfect, no problem. And those of you who are remote today, if you want a printed copy of the exam Monday, you can stop by and grab one, or come to class and grab one. If not, feel free to just print it yourself, or to do it on the computer, whatever is easier for you. All right, let me flip to our proper spot here. All right, so we had been talking about the Rorschach and looking at all the ink blots and all that good stuff. Overzealously moving my mouse right now. Okay. As slow as possible. Hey, there we go. Okay. So now we'll talk about scoring for the Rorschach. And the scoring for the Rorschach is tough. And part of this is probably because I only ever gave 2, and so I didn't get more efficient at it. But each one I gave took me about 3 hours to score and interpret. And that was before I wrote up the actual result, like the report. So an MMPI would take me about half hour, 45 minutes to interpret, but I did a lot of it. So as Goldberg, my Rorschach trainer, said, it takes a couple of whiles to score the Rorschach. Actually, I was wrong. Gosh, this is an example of my memory, making it not as bad. It actually took 6 hours each. Woo, okay. I'm glad I wrote that down, because in my mind, I was like, it wasn't that bad. So there are structural summary sheets you can help to guide you. I think I have a copy of that. Let me just put the under. Yep. So you mark everything down as you score it, and that helps you work through everything. And you use all these different things for each of their responses. So remember, there's 10 cards, they've got to have at least 14 responses. So you're going to have at least some of the cards where they have more than one response. So sometimes they'll just go. Sometimes you'll hand them one and they'll be like, it could be this, or it could be this, or it could be this. And you might have a lot. So the first is what we were talking about at the end of class on Monday, which is the location. So looking at where on the block it is. So this way, right? And which part of it are they using? Are they using the negative space? Are they using just one little piece of it? Are they using the whole thing? And that's something that you code. And sometimes they're using a detail that like nobody uses, and that's an uncommon detail. And then common details are the bigger portions of that, and most people use them. And each of those kind of means something different. Determinants are what about the ink blot determine the response. So did they mention form? Just talking about the shape of the ink blot, the outline of it, essentially. Sometimes people will say movement. So when we were talking about this on Wednesday, people were like, oh, it looks like this person's playing a drum, right? They're not actually moving, but like we're sort of ascribing movement to them, or like these elephants look like they're dancing, something along those lines. So that has a meaning. Color, if the blot does have color, again, some of them are red, some of them have those pastels. Are they talking about the color or are they ignoring it, right? That has meaning. And then shading and texture. So I mentioned how my friend talked about like, oh, does it look like a rug because it's fuzzy, that type of thing. Or if they talk about, you know, sort of those shading around the edges of the block, that means something. Form quality. Hang on, I'll do this so you guys can see all the words better. Is to what extent that's supposed to be. I've used these slides for a while, never noticed that typo before. Oh, cool. Does the subject's response match the objective stimulus qualities of the ink block? So basically this is, can you see what they're seeing? Is it actually matching up? Is it reflecting something that's indicated in the book? Or does it just seem really out there, right? And so this is dependent upon the examiner's ability to judge, right? So there's a big subjective component here. And then you give it an F plus or a plus, and that means it's very good, it matches well. F is just good, and if it's not matching at all, you give it an F minus or a minus, and the F just stands for form. In terms of content, we look for, are they talking about it looking human? Are they mentioning an animal? Are they mentioning other things in nature, like, oh, that looks like a tree, right? Something along those lines. And here you have to like remember what are animals, right? Because like, if they say like a starfish, that's actually an animal, right? So things along those lines. And then based on research, they know which responses are popular, and it's going to be based on the interpretive system you use. So again, I'm trained in the Exner system, but there are several other systems which we'll look at in a few minutes. But for example, some of the ones that are, they call them originary, that's a word right there, right? But like, they call them ordinary in here, that are like common, is, you know, if we're looking at the one that kind of could look like a rug or something along those lines, people will say, oh, this looks like a fan, like one of those fans you go like this with, or a fur pelt, right? Again, exactly how I just described it, right? Things along those lines. But an unusual one or original one would be something like, it looks like an airplane, or it looks like a prehistoric bird, things along those lines. And that's actually coded differently than if you just say bird. So there you go. So there's popular responses are seen in approximately a third of all protocols. Like, their reason they're popular, right? Like, people just see the same things because that's what it looks like. So some unusual content is rarely reported by the average test taker, but has become associated with individuals with emotional, neurological, or cognitive impairments. So we kind of look at those things as well. So I'm trying to remind myself of this because, again, it's been 12, 13 years since I've given a workshop. But for example, there are certain combinations of things that we know, like people who have suicidal potential tend to endorse. And people with paranoia look at certain things more, certain ways more. So as I mentioned, there's a whole host of scoring systems. I learned Exner, and I think Exner is the one with the most research behind it, probably the most commonly used. But there are other interpreter systems to use. All right, so the Rorschach is pretty controversial. Examiners held strong and conflicting opinions about the use and value of this technique. The reason I had to attend a special workshop to learn to do this is because our program just didn't bother teaching that, because they thought it was a bunch of hooey, because they were MMPI research people, right? But there are certain places that if you go to work, particularly in like the Northeast, that they expect you to know how to do the worship. And so we requested, can you train us how to do this? Because this will help us in the future. So many highly trained and highly experienced examiners say they get valuable information you don't get in other ways. And certainly I found that to be the case for one of the two I gave for sure. It was a woman who was inpatient hospitalized, and like, they just couldn't figure out why she wasn't really getting better, like she was running out of insurance money, and they were like, we don't know what's going on. And essentially from the Rorschach I got, which I gave her an MMPI as well, and it didn't happen that she was having like some ambiguous feelings about this. And so I presented, there's a technique I also learned in grad school called therapeutic assessment or therapeutic feedback, where you use the feedback from assessment results essentially to help people come to realizations in therapy. And with her, I kind of did that, like, oh, it's saying this. What do you think about that? Does that feel, accurate at all? And what came out is that she and her husband had been like not having a great marriage, and she just like really wasn't excited to go home. She wasn't scared, he wasn't abusing her, but like did not want to go and face that. So, we were able to use that information to help her work through that and help her not have to start paying massive amounts of money out of pocket for her stay. But research findings rarely empirically validate these claims for a variety of reasons. I mean, one is that honestly, probably the majority of people who use the Rorschach don't use any info for questionnaire. They just give it and like, this is what they saw, so here's what I think that means. And different scoring systems can also lead to different interpretations. So there's an article, Wood et al., and they talk about the Rorschach. And these are just some of the examples of the criticism. It was never normed in any type of way. There was never like a large normative sample that they used. People argue that it over pathologizes and it makes everybody look like they have a lot of severe psychopathology because it sort of assumes they do. That the scoring can be unreliable. There's a lack of a consistent relationship between scores and diagnoses. It doesn't add to, like, if you're trying to use this as a diagnostic tool, which is one of the things it was originally designed for, it doesn't add to that above like doing an intake interview and asking the people about the symptoms, essentially. And then just the fact that like there's not a standard amount of responses, right? Like you need 14, but you could end up with 50 is problematic in and of itself if we're trying to look for consistency. All right, the next projective we're going to talk about is the TAC, which is the thematic apperception test. I've got one of those too. So it has various picture cards. I'm just going to show you, like, I've been showing you those like manuals and technical things for all these. They're pretty, this is the entire manual for the TAC. So, take that as you will. So some cards are generic, some are age or gender specific. And the idea behind this, the whole idea is that the pictures are designed to lend themselves to various interpretations. And the idea is people tell you a story about what they see on the card, and then you interpret things from there. So these are the instructions. I'm going to show you some pictures. I want you to tell me a story about each picture with a beginning, a middle, and an end. Be sure to tell me what will happen and how the characters feel. So then you provide one picture at a time. I'm just trying to find some good ones. I'll put it through here. And you keep the cards face down before you flip them over. And just like the Rorschach, you're supposed to record the responses as verbatim as you can, right? Which can be a challenge because now you're trying to like frantically write what they say, right? And you also record how long it takes them to do it. So we tend to see various themes that come out, the idea of like who is the protagonist in the story, what are the needs, what's pressing them in the, what's causing the action, and then what are the outcomes. So let me just use this one as an example. I don't know how clearly you can see, but there's a woman standing in front of a guy with a plow. She's holding some books, and then there's an older lady in the corner too. So again, I can't interpret a TAT. I've never given one, so I'm not going to be judging you based on your answers. What are some like 2-second, 10-second stories y'all can come up with for this one? Yeah. Oh yeah, I could see that. Little House on the Prairie, yeah. I mean, for me, I see a scenario where like this girl wants to like go to college, right? But she's got to stay at home and help on the farm, right? Just reading the book. But you can interpret it in a bunch of different ways, right? You can interpret like this is her dad, or you can interpret it as like this is a slave or a servant they have, and the implications of that, right? So lots of different ways to interpret it. There's a couple more here, because they're pretty varied. Right? Okay, so like here's another example. It's a guy kind of, I should show our Zoom friends too, a guy kind of hovering over another guy. What could be going on here? Yeah, maybe a shaman or something like that. What else could be going on? Yeah, it could be a priest doing last right. I mean, you could flip what Debbie said and say like he's casting like a bad spell. He's trying to kill this guy, right? All kinds of ways you can interpret it. And again, that's on purpose. That's what it's supposed to do. So if a recurring theme comes up over and over, like every single one, they're talking about heartbreak or I don't know, murder or something, right? It's like we should pay attention to that. And the story can be influenced by many different factors, and it really can't be interpreted without other information. Like you need an interview and a case history. But honestly, in my opinion, that should be true of any assessment you take. Yeah. And then the skill and experience of the examiner will influence the interpretation. The other thing that's really interesting about the TAT is that you give different numbers of cards. Depending on a whole host of things. Sometimes it's just like the whim of the examiner. You never give the full set. And kind of every examiner has their own favorite set. And so like you don't have a consistent baseline to compare on, right? So administration scoring and interpretation procedures are not standardized in any way. So obviously your subjectivity will affect interpretation. And because of that, if you give the TAT to the same person twice, it's going to vary wildly, essentially, especially if you have different examiners give it. It does appear to have some content validity, but criterion-related validity is weak at best. And so it's really what we would argue psychometrically unsound. There is a kids version of the TAT, although you can give the TAT like certain subsets of cards to kids as well. It's designed for kids 3 to 10 years old, and rather than humans, it's got animals, so it's more like a cartoon essentially. And it's designed to provide a balance of positive and negative themes. And research has shown it not more effective than the TAT. And again, these boy-girl cards, it's also gendered to the TAT, and I'm not really sure why. but, reasons that are, Freudian reasons. I'll just leave it at that. Sentence completion. So this I think I mentioned in passing before. You can do this orally, paper and pencil. You could easily throw this into like a Google form in this day and age. So you're given the start of a sentence and asked to complete it, such as I am or a mother. And again, because it's pulling from psychodynamic theory, it's purposely got stuff that'll pull on like Oedipus themes and things like that. The response is revealed believed to reveal information about the person filling it out. Some have standard scoring procedures. In fact, y'all are going to do a sentence completion task that has standard scoring procedures. And then some don't. But this is widely used. And honestly, this is the projective I game most often. So we had to do X number of comprehensive assessments. And that basically meant we took our normal assessments and we did a projective too. And like, it's just so easy to throw it in incomplete sentences. Like it takes maybe 10 minutes for the person to fill out and then you score it later. So like, that's what we would throw in. What I have to say is you do pick up on themes and you can get interesting information this way. So I had a client I was assessing for some memory issues. But she was also in therapy with one of my colleagues to address like mood issues. But one of the things I noticed, and again, here's where you can see where the examiner's interpretation can really influence things. Because I'm trained in eating disorders, I noticed she was talking a lot about food. And not in a way that made me think she had an eating disorder, but just in a way that suggested that she was probably using food as a coping mechanism. And so I mentioned this to her therapist and included it in the report. And her therapist later told me, yeah, that was a thing that we ended up focusing a lot on in therapy. So sometimes you can get some kind of interesting stuff from it. Figure drawings are also pretty common. Again, mostly for kids, but certainly sometimes they're done with adults too. And so there's draw a person. I really just tell them to draw a person. House tree person, we tell them to draw a house, a tree, and a person all together. The kinetic family drawing, so draw your family doing something. And then I just really like the good enough. That was someone's name, but it's just great. Like the good enough draw a man test. Again, just a different set of instructions for drawing a person. Unfortunately, these can be way overinterpreted. Should be used with caution, particularly by people who are untrained in them. The good enough norms, though, do provide useful developmental screening measure that you should follow up with additional information. So in terms of a summary here, they are widely used still, but it's really not recommended because their psychometric properties are not good. So just to give you an example, there are some guidelines for using these in clinical settings, but also in legal settings, what we call forensic psychology. And basically they're like, remember that these are really controversial. These are susceptible to faking, but they don't have validity scales built in. They're routinely used for purposes for which they're invalid or poorly supported. The scoring is unreliable. Norms are non-existent. And there are certain criteria you have to use to allow expert testimony in courts that the courts have laid out. And basically, projectives don't meet those. So it's highly unusual that these would be used in a legal case, essentially, because of all those reasons. Basically, if you do an assessment and it's going to go to court, you want to make sure you can defend every line of your report, every step you took, no problem, right? With projectives, it's really hard to do that. So overall recommendations, they say that the amount of time devoted to educating and training students should be reduced. Certainly it was in my program. If they're covered, then we're supposed to talk about the problems with them, which I did with you all. And then graduate students should be exposed to research about clinical judgment and decision making, so that they know, the research behind those things. Basically, clinical judgment, even by very experienced people, is not always great. So it's better to use more objective things if we can. The other thing we want to make sure is, again, things like the Rorschach sort of assume you have psychopathology. And so it can overpathologize and make people look like they have a lot going on psychologically. And so it's really important to assess in different ways too, to make sure you're not diagnosing this person with schizophrenia when it may just be when they're depressed, they're really down on themselves, not that they're actually very impulsive, right? So you want to assess for things like that. Alrighty, Zoom folks, y'all can actually, if you want to hang on Zoom, you can, but I recommend you just sign off because now we're going to do an in-person thing. So I will have extra copies next week that you can pick up and do with your partner. So I'll leave the Zoom on, but definitely feel free to sign out. People who are here, you get to do our next assessment. So these are a series of short assessments that fall into the personality assessment realm. The first one is the Beck Depression Inventory. So I measure just of depression. I'm actually, like, this makes me a teeny bit sad because Aaron Beck actually passed away this week at the age of 100. He was like huge name in psychology. So, I mean, he lived a very good life. Obviously, it's like capturing research into his 90s. But The next one is called a self-evaluation questionnaire. It's a measure of anxiety. Then you have an incomplete sentence blank. And then you have a measure that's a severity for depression and a very, very brief personality, sort of big five type inventory. Now, here is where you get to decide. Are you going to answer these as yourself? Or are you going to make up a character that might have depression and anxiety more than you, right? And you don't have to do one way or the other. It's really up to you. But, just like make your partner aware if you are acting out of character, just so they don't worry about you, right? I remember we did role plays of like suicidal clients when I was in grad school, and the next time we came in, Dr. Tomasi was like, "I'm really glad to see Karen back here. Really did too good of a job out there." I was like, "No, I'm good, I swear." So go ahead and like, these are ones you would just fill out on your own, a client. You would hand it to the client and the client can fill it out, maybe while they're in the waiting room or something like that. So fill it out for yourself. And then if you get through all of them, come on up and I'll give you the scoring sheet. And then if you get through that, I have an assignment. If not, we'll do that Monday. So Monday is when your exam was scheduled. Again, remember, it is a take home and it's due Wednesday. We are going to have class on Monday. So we'll have time to finish this. And then we'll go to the computer lab and remember what SPSS is, basically. Because hopefully some of y'all started collecting your data, and we'll be needing to use that fairly soon. All right, so I'm just going to hang out up here. So let me know if you have any questions. I'm just going to drop this stuff off in my office. I'll be right back.